August 2, 1943. Treblinka extermination camp, Nazi-occupied Poland. The sun hung mercilessly over the camp, turning the air to liquid heat. The smell of diesel mixed with burned cloth and sweat. Prisoners shuffled past rows of barracks, their movements rehearsed, their faces unreadable. Yet beneath that calm, something trembled, an invisible current of resolve. Near the motor depot, a man adjusted his cap, eyes darting toward a guard tower. Another, a Soviet officer named Alexander Pechersky, bent to tie his shoe, a silent signal. Across the yard, hidden hands moved in rhythm, as if time itself had been waiting for this moment. A sharp crack split the air, then another, and the camp erupted. The armory exploded in a ball of fire, throwing shards of metal across the yard. Columns of black smoke tore into the sky. For a heartbeat, the world stopped, and then chaos began. Guards shouted orders in German and Ukrainian, their rifles clattering as prisoners charged forward. Bullets hissed through the dust. Men fell, but others kept running, their bare feet striking the ground in defiance. The flames spread faster than the fear. Barracks burned, fuel tanks roared, and the iron fences, once symbols of control, glowed red from the heat. In that storm of gunfire and smoke, hundreds chose motion over waiting, courage over certainty. They didn't run to live. They ran so their final act would not be silence. The uprising of Treblinka had begun, a rebellion carved from despair, carried by men who refused to die nameless. If stories of real courage move you, subscribe for more true WW2 Escape Tales. Backstory and stakes. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka was no ordinary camp. It was one of the deadliest places in occupied Europe. Built under Operation Reinhard, its purpose was singular and horrifying: to erase an entire people. In just over a year, nearly 800,000 Jewish men, women and children had been murdered there. Trains arrived daily from Warsaw, Bialystok and beyond, each one ending in silence behind the camp's gates. Those kept alive were chosen not for mercy but for labor. They repaired uniforms, sorted possessions, and maintained the machinery of death. Among them were men like Leib, Feldhendler, a former community leader from Zolkiw, and Alexander Pechersky, a captured Soviet officer who had escaped multiple prisons before being sent to Treblinka. Both understood what few dared to say aloud, that the camp's survivors were only temporary witnesses, destined to be silenced once their work was done. In the early months of 1943, whispers began to circulate among the prisoners. Word had spread that other camps like Sobibor and Belzec were being dismantled, and their remaining prisoners executed to erase evidence. If Treblinka's time was coming, it meant every worker there would soon be gone as well. That realization ignited something that fear had long buried: the will to resist. Feldhendler began quietly organizing trusted prisoners from different work details: mechanics, goldsmiths, even those who worked in the sorting barrack. Each man had access to something useful: fuel, wire, metal fragments, stolen tools. Then fate intervened when Pechersky arrived in September 1942. He had military experience, discipline and a calm authority that inspired others. Together they formed an alliance, a rare union between Polish Jews and Soviet POWs, built on one shared belief: that Treblinka must not vanish without testimony or defiance. Their motive was not survival alone. They wanted to destroy the camp itself, to burn the cremation pits, cripple the guards' machinery, and scatter the ashes of the dead into the open air where the world might finally see. It was by every measure a plan without logic, hundreds of unarmed men facing a garrison of armed guards. But logic had no place left in Treblinka. Night after night they met in whispers inside the workshops, speaking through coded gestures and fragments of Yiddish and Russian. They studied guard rotations, mapped the location of fuel barrels, and noted which officers left their posts after roll call. One mistake could mean collective execution, yet they persisted, driven by something stronger than hope: the conviction that even a doomed act could have meaning. By mid-1943, as trains grew less frequent and the SS began dismantling nearby killing centers, Feldhendler and Pechersky knew time was running out. The prisoners would soon share the fate of those they buried. The uprising became not just a plan for escape, but an act of remembrance, a message carved into history through fire and sacrifice. For the men of Treblinka, freedom no longer meant life beyond the fences. It meant refusing to let the last breath of 1 million victims fade into silence. 3. The impossible situation. Treblinka was not a camp built to hold prisoners. It was built to make them disappear. Every structure, every sound, and every command was engineered for one outcome: death at industrial speed. The camp was divided into precise zones: the Wohnlager living area, the Arbeitslager labor area, and beyond a camouflaged fence, the Totenlager, the killing zone. The air was never still. Smoke from the cremation pits drifted across the camp day and night, thick with the stench of burning wood and human ash. It clung to skin and clothes, making even breathing feel like guilt. The earth trembled with every new arrival: trains screeching, doors slamming, engines idling. Each rumble meant thousands more souls arriving for processing, a word that had lost all meaning inside the barbed wire. Those selected to live a little longer were assigned to labor details that kept the camp's machinery turning. Some sorted clothing and valuables, others repaired engines, built fences, or burned bodies. These men and women were called useful, though all knew that usefulness expired quickly. Every dawn began with roll call, every dusk ended with silence, a silence broken only by the sound of shovels and fire. The guards were a mix of SS officers and Ukrainian auxiliaries, their cruelty alternating between indifference and sudden rage. Watchtowers ringed the perimeter, each one armed with a machine gun. The fences were layered, barbed wire, then minefields beyond. Even the trees had been trimmed to ensure no shadow provided cover. The illusion of total control was everywhere, yet small fractures appeared in that control. Prisoners began to notice tiny patterns: which guards left their posts to smoke, which dogs were chained during certain hours, how long it took for officers to respond when alarms were raised. Every detail was filed away in memory, the first notes of a plan forming in secret. But Treblinka crushed more than bodies. It crushed hope. Each failed escape attempt was punished publicly. Men were hanged in front of others. Their names were never spoken again. Collective punishment ensured that even the thought of rebellion came at a price. Still, small acts of resistance persisted: a hidden prayer, a sabotaged engine, a whispered rumor that the world outside still existed. For most, the camp was a machine that devoured both time and identity. Days blurred into one another until the only measure of survival was the next sunrise. Yet among a few, the unthinkable began to take shape: the belief that even in a place designed to annihilate, human will could strike back. That belief, fragile and reckless, would soon ignite the most daring act ever witnessed behind Treblinka's fences. 4th, the spark, the plan. In early 1943, amid the monotony of death and the grinding rhythm of Treblinka's machinery, a flicker of defiance began to form, fragile, almost impossible. It started with a man named Dr. Julian Czorozicki, a Polish officer and physician. Because of his medical background, he had been placed in charge of the prisoners' infirmary, one of the few positions that allowed limited movement around the camp. Through quiet observation and listening, he began to notice something remarkable. Even the most efficient killing machine had weak points. Guards grew complacent, routines repeated like clockwork, and arrogance made them predictable. Czorozicki understood that if Treblinka could run with such precision, it could also be disrupted with the same logic. He began to share his observations in whispers, brief, coded exchanges with trusted prisoners. A plan began to take shape, fragile but bold, an organized uprising from within. But before his idea could grow, his secret contacts were discovered. Surrounded and questioned by the SS, he refused to give names or information. Knowing what would follow, he swallowed poison rather than risk betrayal. His death sent shockwaves through the prisoners, grief mixed with realization. If a man could die by his own hand rather than surrender to them, then perhaps others could die fighting. After his death, leadership quietly passed to Leib and Feldhendler, a former community head from Zalki. Feldhendler was not a soldier, but he had something just as valuable: patience and the ability to earn trust. He observed carefully, spoke little, and weighed every risk. To many he seemed cautious to the point of hesitation, but in truth he was calculating something vast. He knew open defiance was suicide, yet he also knew that waiting meant certain extinction. Around him gathered a small circle of men from different work units: blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, and those who sorted the belongings of the dead. They met at night in dark corners of the workshops, using the noise of hammers and engines to mask their words. For months they collected fragments of information: which guards drank most heavily, which patrols were delayed, how long the sirens took to respond when triggered. It was during this period that a new prisoner arrived who would change everything: Lieutenant Alexander Pechersky, a Soviet officer captured after a failed escape from a labor camp near Minsk. Pechersky was different. He carried himself with quiet authority, his voice calm, his eyes steady even in the presence of the SS. Feldhendler recognized in him what the others lacked: experience in command, an understanding of strategy, and most of all an unbroken will. When the two men finally met, it was as though two halves of the same defiance had found each other. Feldhendler had the network, Pechersky had the tactics. Together they forged the impossible. Their plan was designed like a military operation. Step 1. Infiltrate the camp's armory. Prisoners from the metal workshop secretly copied the armory key using molten scrap and a wax mold. They practiced until the copy fit perfectly. Step 2. Over several weeks, weapons were stolen in small quantities. A rifle here, a grenade there, hidden inside toolboxes, under wheelbarrows or beneath piles of coal. Each movement was timed during moments of distraction, when guards drank or argued among themselves. To conceal their actions, the prisoners exploited the guards' greed. Vodka and gold, taken from victims' belongings, were offered as gifts for a false holiday celebration. The ruse worked. Several officers, eager for drink and favor, accept that one gesture bought the conspirators crucial hours of freedom within their captivity. Every day after that was torture. One mistake, a missing bullet, a wrong glance could destroy them all, but discipline held. Pechersky repeated the same command: no fear, no rush, no noise. He reminded the men that their goal was not only escape, but legacy. If we die, he told them, let it be as humans, not as shadows. By late July they saw signs that the SS was preparing to dismantle the camp. Trenches were being filled, documents destroyed. The prisoners understood the meaning: witnesses were no longer needed, their time had run out. And so the plan that had lived in whispers and shadows finally took shape in fire and resolve. The men of Treblinka would not wait to be erased. They would strike first to burn the camp, to scatter its ashes, and to remind the world that even in a place built to silence them, resistance could still speak. Quick pause. If you're still watching, it means history matters to you. Subscribe for more true WW2 escape story. 5. Term preparation and tension build-up. The final days before August 2, 1943 unfolded like the tightening of a noose. Every moment inside Treblinka was now a calculation. Each glance, each breath, each sound weighed against the risk of discovery. The prisoners lived two lives at once: obedient laborers by day, silent conspirators by night. In the metal workshop, the clatter of tools covered their secret work. Beneath the sound of hammers and train engines, they smelted fragments of scavenged metal into crude bullets and reshaped stolen casings. Grease-stained hands moved with precision, guided by desperation. A handful of men tested small parts of the stolen rifles under the thunder of locomotives so the noise would vanish into the air. One spark out of place, one bullet fired too soon, and the entire uprising would be over before it began. Every morning the camp's routine resumed: roll calls, forced labor, sorting the belongings of the murdered. But to the conspirators, each ordinary task now served a hidden purpose. They measured the distance between barracks, memorized guard rotations, and noted the hours when the officers left for the nearby Bug River to swim. Even the wind's direction was considered so the smoke from the fires would blow toward the SS barracks, masking movement elsewhere. Feldhendler, quiet and methodical, coordinated the network like an engineer designing an impossible machine. Pechersky, strong-willed and disciplined, drilled the men on timing and restraint. Every detail was rehearsed in whispers: when to cut the phone lines, when to open the armory, when to ignite the fuel depot. They used hand signals to communicate across work zones. Then came disaster. One morning the copy of the armory key, the heart of their plan, went missing. Panic spread like fire through the workshop.
A rumor started that an SS officer had been seen inspecting toolboxes. The prisoners spent the entire night searching, their hands trembling in the dark. Finally, the key was found beneath a workbench where it had fallen during a shift change. No one spoke for hours afterward. Every heartbeat reminded them how fragile survival was. The tension grew unbearable. They knew there would be no second chance. Once the revolt began, it would last minutes, maybe seconds, before the camp's full force responded. Yet in that unbearable pressure, unity took root. Men who had once distrusted each other now shared bread and guarded one another's silence. They were bound by the certainty that none of them would live long enough to see the result, but that the attempt itself would matter. On the morning of August 2, the sky was cloudless and the air hung thick with heat. The conspirators gathered in small groups, pretending to work as usual. Pechersky confirmed the final detail. Most of the senior SS were away swimming in the river. The rest of the guards were drinking, sweating in the midday sun. The prisoners exchanged glances that said everything words could not. Around 3 o'clock, one of them whispered, "Today or never." The hour had come.
6. The escape attempt. At 3:45 p.m., the quiet rhythm of Treblinka shattered. A single explosion erupted near the motor depot, followed by a roar of flames. Within seconds, another blast ripped through the armory, where barrels of fuel ignited in a violent flash. A tower guard turned just as the inferno bloomed below him. His shout was drowned in the rising chaos. Prisoners poured out from the workshops and barracks. The stolen rifles, just a few dozen, were passed from hand to trembling hand. Grenades hidden in buckets and baskets were hurled toward guard posts. Flames leapt from shed to shed as the fire spread with terrifying speed, licking the sky in pillars of smoke. Alexander Pechersky shouted above the noise, his voice carrying through the yard. "Forward, the world is watching." His call was not command, but declaration. The moment history could no longer be silenced. Machine guns opened from the towers. Bullets cut the air like swarms of hornets. Prisoners fell where they stood, but others stepped over them, running, shouting, breaking open the fences. A handful used tools to cut the barbed wire while others piled wooden planks and crates to climb over. The air was thick with gunpowder, fire and human breath. The sound of chaos was deafening. The grinding of engines, the roar of fire, the screams of men torn between terror and purpose. The camp siren wailed, summoning guards from every corner. Ukrainian auxiliaries fired blindly into the smoke. Their silhouettes flashed like shadows behind the flames. In the confusion, groups split apart. Some prisoners charged the main gate, others veered toward the forest. The minefield beyond the fence claimed many. Explosions erupted underfoot, sending earth and limbs into the air. Still they ran. Pechersky and a group of escapees reached the edge of the woods, turning only once to see the camp behind them engulfed in fire. The sky above Treblinka, once grey with ash, now burned orange with defiance. Back in the camp, Feldhendler stayed behind with a few men, coordinating others still trapped inside. They set additional fires to fuel the chaos, throwing oil onto wooden walls. For a moment, even the SS officers seemed unsure whether to fight or flee. Ammunition stores exploded one after another, shaking the ground like distant thunder. Everywhere men screamed for freedom, not with words but motion. Some grabbed rifles from fallen guards. Others used bare hands to fight their way forward. For many, the final choice was to die running rather than waiting. By sunset, Treblinka was unrecognizable, flames tearing through the barracks, smoke covering the horizon. Roughly 700 prisoners had joined the uprising. Around 200 broke through the perimeter. The rest lay dead or dying within sight of the woods. In that single hour, the impossible had happened. A death camp had rebelled. Treblinka's silence, built over a year of murder, had been broken by the very people it sought to destroy. The guards would regain control before nightfall, but they could never undo what had been done. The fire would burn long into the evening, carrying with it a message meant for the world beyond those fences, that even in a place built for erasure, humanity had refused to vanish quiet. 7. Crisis point. Near failure. The uprising that had taken months of secret planning began not with precision, but with a mistake. Even before the first explosion, fate intervened. One of the bombs placed near the fuel depot failed to detonate. The fuse sparked and fizzled out, sending up a puff of smoke that caught the eye of a nearby guard. Within seconds he shouted an alarm, raising his rifle toward the yard. The plan meant to unfold in silence and timing was thrown into chaos. The armory was breached too early. Prisoners who were supposed to be waiting for the signal heard the commotion and acted instinctively. Communication between work zones collapsed in the space of a heartbeat. What had been designed as a coordinated strike turned into a desperate rush for survival. The revolt began nearly 30 minutes ahead of schedule. Half the camp, unaware, the other half already fighting for their lives. For a moment confusion reigned. Some prisoners, hearing the first shots, thought it was another SS drill or an execution. They froze in place, paralyzed by the memory of hundreds of similar sounds. Others crouched behind barrels and fences, unsure whether the revolt had truly begun. The tension snapped when a fuel barrel exploded near the motor depot, the second blast that turned hesitation into motion. Within minutes the camp's towers came alive with fire. Machine guns thundered from every direction, their tracers carving orange lines through the thick smoke. The air filled with the sharp metallic tang of gunfire, the acrid bite of burning diesel, and the sound of men screaming commands no one could hear. Bullets tore through the open yard as prisoners sprinted toward the fences. Many fell instantly, cut down mid-stride. Others kept running, driven by something deeper than hope, a refusal to stop. A grenade thrown near the kitchen detonated against a wall, killing both guards and prisoners, shattering windows and sending fragments of tin into the air. The blast ignited nearby fuel barrels and flames began to crawl toward the workshops where ammunition was hidden. The explosions that followed came in rhythmic waves, echoing like distant thunder across the fields. Amid the chaos, Alexander Pechersky fought to keep direction alive. He shouted until his voice broke, urging men toward the woods. "Run! To the forest! Go!" he cried. But the noise drowned his words. Some prisoners already injured turned back to help others, dragging the wounded through the smoke. They knew what it meant. Slowing down meant dying, yet they did it anyway. Even in the middle of horror, compassion endured. Near the main gate, a group of prisoners armed with crowbars and an iron beam tried to force it open. The hinges groaned and bent but held firm under the weight of steel. Then in a final surge they rammed it again. The gate gave way, just as a burst of gunfire tore through the line. Several men fell instantly. The survivors stepped over their bodies and ran, scattering into the open fields beyond. Some reached the outer perimeter, where the minefield awaited. Explosions ripped through the ground as they crossed, earth and smoke rising around them. The rest ran toward the Bug River, shimmering in the distance under the afternoon sun. For many it represented freedom, but the guards on the far bank were already waiting. Bullets struck the water like raindrops. Some prisoners waded in, others dove, trying to swim through the current. A few made it across, most did not. The river became a mirror of sacrifice, carrying bodies and torn uniforms downstream like silent witnesses. Inside the camp, Leib Feldhendler saw the plan unraveling. The signals were lost, the timing shattered, yet there was no retreat. He gathered the men still near the workshops, and gave the only order left to give. "Scatter, Leib. Tell them what happened here." His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed the weight of what had been lost. By nightfall the gunfire faded. The sky above Treblinka glowed red, reflecting the fires that devoured the barracks. The air reeked of smoke, ash and iron. Bodies lay scattered across the yard, prisoners and guards alike, their faces lit by the last embers of burning wood. The uprising had failed in coordination but triumphed in spirit. Against every rule, every weapon and every calculation it had still happened. The unthinkable had occurred inside the most controlled place on earth. And somewhere beyond the fences, beneath the burning sky, a few figures still moved through the darkness, exhausted, wounded, but alive. Each step they took carried the story of Treblinka away from the fire, out into a world that would one day listen. Quick reminder, stay with us. Subscribe to uncover more real tales of courage and survival from World War II. Breakthrough through success or tragedy. By the time the gunfire faded, Treblinka was unrecognizable. The camp that once functioned with mechanical precision now burned like a furnace of rebellion. Barracks collapsed one after another, wooden beams glowing orange before disintegrating into ash. The armory detonated with a deafening crack,
scattering debris across the yard. The sky, once grey with the smoke of victims, now carried the fire of defiance. The revolt had lasted barely an hour, but it had changed everything. Where silence and submission had ruled, chaos now reigned. The SS scrambled for control, shouting orders lost in the roar of the flame. Their dogs barked wildly, their commands drowned by the noise of explosions and the terrified cries of the wounded. Groups of prisoners who had broken through the fences fled toward the forest, their bare feet cutting against thorns and wire. Some stumbled over mines, others vanished into the thick smoke. Behind them the towers still spat bullets, cutting down those too slow or too weak to run. Yet even those who fell had broken the unspoken rule of the camp, that no one resist. By late afternoon, reinforcements from nearby units arrived to find Treblinka engulfed. The SS began shooting anyone they found alive. Fires raged through the night, consuming the barracks, the workshops, and the records office. What had once been the most efficient killing center in occupied Poland was now a charred skeleton of itself. And yet, amid the devastation, some had escaped. Of the roughly 700 prisoners who took part, about 200 reached the wood. Many were hunted down in the following days, but some endured, hiding in barns, joining partisan groups, or finding shelter with sympathetic villagers. Around 70 survivors would live to tell the story, among them Alexander Pechersky and Samuel Willenberg, whose testimony would later give the uprising its voice. For the SS, the rebellion was a humiliation. They had lost control of a system built on orders came down to dismantle the camp completely, to remove every trace of its existence. But destruction could not erase what had already been done. The revolt had sent a signal that even in the most hopeless of places, defiance was still possible. When dawn came, smoke still rose from the ruins. The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat, but of consequence, the quiet that comes after an act too immense to measure. Treblinka, the camp built to annihilate, had been forced to witness its own undoing. The victory was not in numbers, it was in meaning. In that hour of terror and fire, a few hundred prisoners had accomplished what no army could. They had broken the illusion of Nazi invincibility. The revolt's legacy was not measured by survival, but by remembrance, by the proof that even in the darkest system ever created, human courage could still burn brighter than fear. In aftermath and historical context, the flames of Treblinka faded, but the echo of the uprising refused to die. What began as a desperate bid for life became one of the most powerful acts of human defiance in history. It was a moment that proved resistance could exist, even in a place designed for complete extermination. Alongside the later revolt at Sobibor, the Treblinka Uprising stood as one of only two organized rebellions within Nazi death camps, a reminder that courage survived where hope was meant to perish. In the immediate aftermath, Treblinka was a smoldering ruin. The SS, furious and humiliated, returned to find their most secret site of mass murder engulfed in ashes. For days they searched the surrounding countryside, hunting for escapees. Armed patrols and dogs combed through the forests, executing anyone suspected of aiding fugitives. Yet even in this brutal retaliation, the revolt had achieved the unthinkable. It had halted the machinery of death. The camp never resumed full operation. Determined to erase all trace of what had happened, the Nazis dismantled Treblinka piece by piece. Within weeks, barracks were torn down, the gas chambers destroyed, and the cremation pits buried beneath layers of sand and gravel. The ground that had consumed hundreds of thousands was disguised under a new face, a farm, complete with a house and livestock, built to deceive any who might stumble upon it. By late 1943, Treblinka had vanished from the landscape, but the memory of its revolt was already carried beyond those borders. By the few who had survived, the survivors scattered in every direction, some hid in barns or fields, others joined resistance groups in the forest. A few reached the advancing Soviet lines months later, their bodies thin, their faces haunted, but their voices still unbroken. Men like Leib, Feldhendler, Samuel Willenberg, and Alexander Pechersky became living witnesses to an event so improbable that it defied imagination. They endured cold, hunger, and betrayal, yet never let the truth be silenced. Each survivor's testimony became part of the world's understanding of Treblinka. They described the camp not as a statistic, but as a system built from human cruelty and challenged by human will. Their stories carried names, faces, sounds, the kind of truth that no document or report could convey. In their words, Treblinka ceased to be an abstract horror. It became a place where ordinary people achieved something extraordinary, moral resistance in its purest form. In the years after the war, these testimonies reached classrooms, museums and memorials. They revealed how a handful of prisoners, armed with stolen tools and courage, shattered one of the deadliest engines of murder ever built. The uprising that many once dismissed as futile became a symbol of survival through conscience. Justice, though delayed, was shaped by their words, the accounts of those who had walked through fire and lived to tell of it. Today, the site of Treblinka is quiet. No buildings remain, no tracks, no fences, only a vast field of stones. More than 17,000 stones, each engraved with the name of a town or village, whose people vanished there. The silence is heavy, but it speaks more than sound ever could. It tells of loss, yes, but also of defiance, of a moment when people stripped of everything still chose to act, to resist, to be remembered. The uprising was never about victory in the military sense. It was about reclaiming identity in the face of annihilation. The men and women of Treblinka did not fight because they expected to live. They fought because they refused to disappear, unnamed. Their story remains one of the clearest affirmations of the human spirit, proof that even at the edge of extinction, courage can still burn brighter than fear. Top of form, bottom of form. 10. The bottom line: they knew they could not win, but they refused to vanish without a voice. The uprising at Treblinka was not born from hope of survival, but from the conviction that silence was the final victory of evil. In the smoke that rose over the camp, something greater than fire took shape, a declaration that even in the face of annihilation, the will to resist could not be extinguished. History records battles by numbers and outcomes, but courage like this defies both. It exists not in victory but in refusal. The men and women of Treblinka proved that freedom begins the moment fear ends, even if it lasts only an instant. If stories of real courage inspire you, subscribe for more true WW2 Escape Tales.